Welcome to NightStoryX Fear, where every whisper hides a secret and every story leaves a scar. If you dare to listen, then like, share, and subscribe before the darkness takes you. And tell us in the comments what haunts you the most. NightStoryX Fear, where fear never sleeps.
Story 1. The Singing Sands of Route 50, Nevada. Location: U.S. Route 50, the loneliest road in America, outside Fallon, Nevada. Ethan was a long-haul trucker who knew the deserts of Nevada better than his own apartment. This leg of the journey down the infamous Route 50 was usually routine: silence, heat, and the endless sweep of the high desert, which tonight felt heavier than usual. Around 2 a.m., miles from the nearest town or light source, Ethan pulled his massive rig onto a rarely used, barely visible dirt track for a mandated 30-minute rest stop. The engine sighed, and the air conditioning died, leaving him with the oppressive, dry heat. The silence that descended was absolute, except for the tiny tick of the cooling engine and the sound of his own breathing, a sound that suddenly felt dangerously loud in the vacuum. This vast emptiness, which he usually found calming, now felt like a deliberate trap. He was settling into his bunk when he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like fine dust shifting over glass, or grains of sugar trickling onto wood. It was coming from the low dunes surrounding the track. He dismissed it as wind shifting the sand, a common phenomenon. But then the sound changed. It grew deeper, resolving itself into a low, resonant, humming note. It wasn't the wind or mechanical. It sounded less like shifting sand and more like a colossal, distant pipe organ, playing a single, sustained, impossibly deep chord right out of the earth itself. The frequency was so low, it felt less heard and more felt, vibrating in the pit of his stomach. Ethan grabbed his industrial-strength flashlight and peered out the passenger window. He saw nothing but the silver-gray sand stretching to the black horizon, the emptiness pressing against the cab. Yet the sound was intensifying, vibrating through the aluminum floor of the truck and up through his boots. The sand was not just humming, it sounded like the desert itself was trying to sing a mournful, ancient dirge. He decided to cut the rest short and leave, a creeping sense of panic tightening his throat. But as he reached for the ignition, he heard footsteps in the sand, not the crunch of heavy boots, but a soft, sliding shh sound, circling the perimeter of the rig. And the humming was now accompanied by a second, higher note, a piercing, unnerving disharmony that felt like a drill boring directly into his molars. He peered through the side mirror. Nothing. He checked the other mirror. Still nothing. His heart hammered out a furious rhythm against his ribs. Then a shape moved into the flashlight beam cast by his passenger door. It wasn't human. It was a dense column of sand and dust, standing about 7 feet tall, its surface twisting and swirling as if animated by its own current. It had no discernible head or limbs, but where a face might be, the sand swirled fastest, forming a disturbing, hungry vortex. The humming intensified, and Ethan realized the second higher note wasn't coming from the sand or the air. It was coming from the rig. The air brakes began to hiss spontaneously, the hydraulics whining and screaming in response to the deep sound. The entire truck was vibrating so violently the cabin doors rattled against their frames, threatening to burst open. Ethan locked the doors, his hands slick with sweat. The sand column moved right to the driver's side window. The vortex, where its face should be, stopped spinning, and the column of sand pressed flat against the glass, smearing across the surface like a massive dry palm. It was an act of cold, inhuman communication, and the pressure was immense. Through the glass, Ethan watched in terror as the sand began to darken, turning a deep, unsettling black as if it was actively leaching the metallic integrity and heat from the truck. The air inside the cab dropped instantly. The humming note dropped low, then pulsed like a monstrous heart beginning to beat. "You stop here," a voice boomed, not from outside, but reverberating directly from the radio speaker, despite the radio being turned off. The voice was bone-dry and vast, stretching across centuries. "You stay here, with the sound, forever." Ethan threw the truck into gear, ignoring the seatbelt, and floored the accelerator. He didn't bother looking, just ripped the wheels across the sand, the heavy truck bucking violently as it tore back onto Route 50. He drove without stopping, pushing the machine far past its limits for 6 hours straight, the rising sun offering no comfort. When he finally pulled over in Ely, trembling and sick, the patch of glass where the entity touched the cab was permanently stained black, looking like charred metal, and the low pulsing vibration never quite left the floorboards beneath his feet.
Story 2. The Cold Light of the Tundra, Alaska. Location: a remote, abandoned gold prospector's shack deep in the Alaskan interior, near the Yukon River. Maya and her boyfriend Chris were experienced, if somewhat reckless, wilderness trekkers. They chose the Alaskan interior in early November, a brutal test of survival, a place where the landscape was its own predator. Their destination was an old, abandoned prospector's shack, weeks away from any road or satellite communication. They were truly at the end of the world. After 2 weeks of grueling travel, pushing through heavy snows, they found the shack. A tiny, sagging wooden cube, half buried in permafrost. They spent the evening huddled by a small, pathetic fire, grateful for the minimal warmth. The immense, silent white landscape stretched out beyond the single frosted window, a massive, indifferent void of black sky and white earth. That night, the cold was profound, biting into their bones even through thick sleeping bags. Maya awoke shivering violently, needing more firewood. Chris was asleep, his breathing shallow, but something felt fundamentally wrong. The air in the shack was not just cold, it was unnaturally sterile and thin, and the profound silence was broken by a soft, rhythmic click. She carefully peeled back her frost-covered sleeping bag and crept to the window. The light outside wasn't moonlight. It was a uniform, blinding, ice-blue glow that illuminated the entire horizon in an unearthly, synthetic brilliance. It looked less like natural light and more like the entire world had been encased in a colossal sheet of energized ice. Then she saw what was making the sound. Outside the window, maybe 20 feet away, stood a shape that looked like a very tall, extremely thin man, completely naked, his skin a shocking, vibrant blue under the cold light. His clicking sound was the rapid, involuntary chattering of his jaw, a mechanical sound of endless, desperate cold. His arms were held stiffly at his sides, and he was rotating in place, slowly, hypnotically, like a lighthouse made of suffering. He was staring directly at the shack, his head snapping back to the window every time he completed a quarter turn. Maya gently shook Chris awake. "Look, don't make a sound, just look." Chris stared for a long time, the color draining from his face, his breath instantly fogging the already cold air. He said, "It's hypothermia," he whispered, disbelieving, clutching at a rational explanation. Some poor soul froze and went mad, maybe miles away. As if responding to the faint sound of their voices, the softest human whisper, the blue figure stopped rotating. It stood motionless for a full minute, its back to them, presenting a profile of inhuman rigidity. Then the figure turned its head with a sharp, sickening snap. Its eyes were wide, lidless, and entirely black, reflecting the cold blue light like polished obsidian. It didn't approach the shack, but instead it lowered its head and began to lick the frozen ground in slow, deliberate scraping motions, like an animal desperate for moisture. Chris watched horrified as the figure's body began to steam slightly, the air around it shimmering from the sudden, inexplicable exchange of energy. "It's trying to get warmer," Chris choked out, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "By consuming the ice, it's becoming the cold." The clicking intensified, a manic, accelerating rhythm. The figure started moving, not toward the shack, but in a massive, accelerating circle around them, its feet kicking up ice shards, the blue light spinning and flickering like a deadly strobe. As the creature ran, the ground began to vibrate with deep, resonant thuds, and the frost on the window slowly began to crack in an intricate spiderweb pattern spreading outward from the center. Maya grabbed their survival radio, frantically trying to tune a signal, hoping for anything but the clicking. Just as the blue runner completed its loop and stopped right outside their thin wooden door, the radio suddenly burst to life. It wasn't static, but a voice, a thin, high, screeching sound that said in perfect English, "You didn't ask me to stop. You must watch. You must feel the cold that runs inside." They spent the rest of the night huddled together in pure, paralyzed terror, listening to the rhythmic, frantic clicking of the thing's jaw, which had placed itself directly against the thin wooden worm. A constant, chilling reminder that they were being perfectly watched, waiting for them to finally open the door and join the cold light. Story 3. The Silence of the Hollow, Appalachian Mountains, West Virginia. A dirt road in the most isolated part of the Monongahela National Forest. Max and Lisa were driving back from a remote camping trip in the Appalachian Mountains. They considered themselves wilderness savvy, but even they felt a profound unease after taking a wrong turn onto an unmarked, deeply rutted dirt path. The path plunged down into a hollow so dark and enclosed that the dense canopy of ancient trees seemed to swallow the late afternoon light whole. The car sputtered, choked, and died, the engine giving up with a final pathetic hiss. Max cursed, checking the engine, but knew it was pointless. Dead. No cell service, naturally. We're in the deepest part of the hollow, and it's gonna be dark soon. They were completely surrounded by thick, silent woods. The air was heavy, damp, smelling of rich black earth and the sickly sweet scent of decay. Lisa noticed the strangest thing. The woods were completely silent. Not just quiet, silent. There were no bird song, no cicadas, no buzz of insects, no rustle of leaves, not even the faint whisper of wind they'd heard on the ridge. It was an unnatural, oppressive void of sound that pressed against their eardrums, creating a high-pitched ringing. "Max," Lisa whispered, her voice sounding foreign and tiny. "Where are the crickets? Where are the birds? This feels wrong." Max looked around, finally noticing the oppressive stillness. "Maybe the air is too thick here," he suggested weakly, but his eyes were wide with rising panic. They decided to wait until morning, huddled in the car. As dusk settled, the darkness became so profound it felt physical, like thick velvet pressing against the glass. Max finally got a tiny, desperate spark from the battery and managed to get the radio to play low static. It was better than the terrifying vacuum of the silence. Around 11 p.m., the static suddenly cleared, and a high-pitched, thin voice came through, whispering with unnerving clarity. "Are you scared yet?" Max fumbled violently with the dial, hitting buttons, trying to bury the sound, but the voice remained clear and malicious. "You shouldn't be here. This place is quiet for a reason. Everything that screams dies." Then, from the trees directly beside the car, came a series of horrifying sounds. A sharp, sickening pop, followed by a horrible, muffled gurgle. The sound repeated 3 times, each one distinct and gut-wrenching. The radio voice laughed, a dry, hacking sound that seemed to come from something with a chest full of wet ash. That was the deer. Now the rabbit. Now the squirrel. They all scream for you. Max and Lisa watched in terror as the car windows, thick with dust and grime, slowly began to clear in the darkness, not wiped from the outside, but cleared from the inside of the glass, revealing a perfectly round, palm-sized wet spot.
The moisture seemed to condense out of the stagnant air. The same terrifying clearing happened on the back window, then the driver's side window. The clear spots were all positioned at the height of a peering face, perfect sightlines into their shared terror. And then the radio voice said, in a tone of terrifying anticipation, "Now let's hear the bride scream." Lisa looked at Max, her face pale. Max wasn't looking at the windows anymore. He was staring at the dashboard. A faint red light was glowing from beneath the emergency brake handle, a light that had not been there moments before. Max's hand shook violently as he reached down and slowly pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden doll tied with dark brown hair and wrapped in a piece of faded gingham fabric. It had been meticulously hidden inside the console. Max looked at Lisa, his eyes wide and blank with cold realization. "I didn't know I had this," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't remember putting this here. It gave me a piece of itself." Just then, a massive, thick hand, bristling with coarse hair, slammed onto the roof of the car, making the metal shriek and buckle inward. The car pitched violently to one side. From the trees, a booming, ancient voice roared, "She is mine now. Your silence is broken." The voice was so deep, it vibrated Max's teeth and shook the ground. The last sound they heard before the car door was ripped violently from its hinges, a tearing sound of metal and human despair, was the frantic, high-pitched static scream coming from the radio, now perfectly mimicking the agonized sound of a terrified woman.
Story 4. The Inescapable Horizon, Nebraska. Location: an isolated farmstead with a single silo, miles from any main road on the Nebraska prairie. Ben was a photographer scouting locations for a major project on rural American isolation. He had driven 3 hours down progressively smaller dirt roads, finally finding the perfect spot. A decaying farmhouse next to a massive, empty grain silo surrounded by nothing but flat, golden prairie stretching for 50 miles in all directions. The isolation was profound. The nearest light pollution was beyond the horizon. He arrived at sunset and set up his tripod near the silo, planning to shoot the tranquil blue hour. The silence here was different from the forest or desert. It was not natural silence, but a heavy, inescapable emptiness, as if the sound had been vacuumed out of the landscape. As the light began to fade to violet and indigo, Ben noticed a figure standing near the farmhouse porch, completely still. It was a man in dark, worn overalls and a wide-brimmed straw hat, leaning on a fence post with unnatural stillness. He assumed it was the owner, though he had secured permission to be there, and the house looked long abandoned. Ben raised his hand in a polite wave. The figure didn't move a millimeter. He continued setting up his camera, adjusting the aperture, focusing on the silo's dark, looming presence. When he looked back, less than a minute later, the figure was gone. 10 minutes later, he saw the man again.
But this time, he wasn't by the porch. He was standing directly in front of the silo door, his back to Ben. Ben felt a sudden icy chill crawl up his spine. The figure was clearly too tall, towering over the silo's base, and it was too stiff, completely immobile, its posture like that of a poorly balanced wooden puppet. Ben decided instantly that the photo wasn't worth it. He packed up, his hands fumbling with the tripod quick release. As he worked, he stole anxious glances at the figure. Every time he looked up, the figure was always in a new location, impossibly distant and then impossibly close. Once by the broken tractor, once near the wind pump. Each move brought it closer to Ben's position near the fence line, its perfect stillness mocking the vast distance of the prairie. The final time he looked up, the figure was standing only 20 feet away, its wide-brimmed hat casting its face into perpetual shadow. "Evening," Ben said, trying to sound casual, but his voice cracked, thin and pathetic in the heavy air. The figure didn't reply. It simply lifted a long, unnaturally thin arm, the elbow bending at a grotesque angle, and pointed, not at Ben, but down. Ben looked down at his feet. The prairie grass was dry and brittle, but he noticed a large circle of freshly turned earth right where he was standing. The earth was moist, almost black, looking like a fresh grave. He backed away slowly, meticulously, terrified to break eye contact with the hat. The figure still hadn't spoken, but Ben heard a low, scraping sound from beneath the ground where he had just been standing. It sounded like something large and heavy was trying to claw its way out of the newly disturbed earth, groaning against the soil. The figure finally tilted its head, and the shadow shifted just enough for Ben to see what lay beneath the brim of the hat. There were no eyes, no mouth, but smooth, perfectly clean, unstained white cloth stretched taut where the face should be. The fabric looked ancient and suffocatingly tight. "You must watch your spot. Someone is always waiting for you to find their spot. It's their turn to breathe." Ben sprinted for his truck, not bothering to stow his gear, throwing his camera into the passenger seat and jumping into the driver's side. As he tore away, he looked back in the side mirror. The figure was standing right in the center of the road, and it was no longer alone. A cluster of those figures, stiff, impossibly tall, faceless men in dark overalls, was emerging silently from the tall prairie grass, standing like scarecrows in the fading light. And the man in the lead, the one who had been pointing, had pulled the white cloth away from his face, revealing only a dark, empty cavity that seemed to be actively inhaling the twilight air, drawing the very silence of the prairie into itself.
Story 5. The Silent Patrol, Texas Borderland. Location: an isolated, sun-bleached desert road in Big Bend Ranch State Park, near the Rio Grande. Sarah and Dean were on a road trip, taking a scenic, unpaved route through the harsh Texas borderlands. The landscape was beautiful, but terrifyingly empty. Vast, jagged mountains, endless scrubland, and a heat that promised death to the unprepared. After hitting a sharp rock, they got a flat tire, leaving them stranded miles from the nearest highway or ranch with no cell service. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the metal of the truck. Dean got the spare on, but they desperately needed water and couldn't risk driving further without confirmation of their direction. As Dean checked the worn paper map, Sarah noticed something moving in the hazy heat shimmer near the horizon. It was a patrol, but it wasn't a truck. It was a line of 5 or 6 individuals, walking with an unnerving, perfect military synchronization. They were completely silent and relentless. They were wearing long, dark, heavy jackets, entirely impractical for the intense heat, and wide-brimmed black felt hats pulled low. They carried no weapons, no packs, and they moved with a silent, relentless, agonizingly slow cadence across the scrubland. Maybe border patrol? Dean suggested, relieved by the thought of human contact. Sarah shook her head, a cold knot forming in her stomach. They're moving too slowly. Look at their shadow. The sun was high, directly overhead, but the shadow cast by each figure was impossibly long and sharp, stretching behind them like a dark, distorted, tapering tail on the dusty ground. It defied the laws of physics. They watched in silent dread as the patrol reached a distant, rusted-out cattle fence. Instead of opening the gate, the figures simply marched straight through the barbed wire. The wire snapped and curled, but the figures never broke their stride, seeming completely impervious to the obstruction. A primal fear seized Sarah. "We need to go. Now, Dean. They aren't right." Dean started the truck, throwing gravel as he accelerated. They put the desolate landscape behind them, driving fast for 10 minutes, the engine laboring under the heat. Finally, they rounded a large bend in the road, relieved they were out of sight. Dean slowed down to check the oil pressure, breathing a heavy sigh of relief. "I think we're clear," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. Sarah froze. They were clear of the back road, but standing right in front of the truck, blocking their path entirely, was the silent patrol. They hadn't run, they hadn't driven. They had simply rematerialized and were now arranged in a perfect semicircle, completely blocking the narrow road. They still hadn't moved a muscle since stopping. Then the two figures on the ends of the semicircle began to move, taking slow, synchronized steps towards the truck's doors. As the nearest figure approached the driver's side, Sarah saw a detail that made her blood run cold. The fabric of the dark jacket was not cloth. It was a tightly woven mat of dry, tanned human skin, stitched crudely together with heavy black thread. And where the neck met the jacket, the skin was stretched tight, revealing no discernible head or face, but just the dark, empty void of the jacket collar pulled high. The figure reached the window and stopped. It lifted its hand, and with the sound of dry leather scraping against glass, it began to tap the window with its knuckles. The sound was soft, rhythmic, and chilling. Tap, tap, tap. Then from the center of the silent patrol, a voice came, not loud, but completely flat, dry and mechanical, like an automated message coming from a decades-old machine. "You have been observed. You are now part of the survey. The isolation belongs to us. You must remain a fixed point. Your journey is complete." Dean screamed and slammed the truck in reverse, tearing back the way they came, the tires screeching uselessly on the dust. Sarah looked back in the rearview mirror as the silent patrol began to walk forward, their impossibly long, dark shadows trailing behind them, never running but always relentlessly gaining ground.